Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Ancharski's AP World History. We're still on Unit 5. This is our last presentation. So Chapter 7, What is Going On in North and South America? The actual title is not that per se, but that's what we're talking about in this presentation. So the bellwork for today, describe one Latin American revolution. All right, let's get started. So today we're going to talk about developments in North and South America, so the Americas. This is topic 5.8, and the lesson objective for today is explain the causes and effects of calls for change in industrial societies from 1750 to 1900. And just as a really quick point before we get started today, when we talk about American, we're referring to North and South America, so the continents, not just the United States, even though we will talk about the United States today. So be careful when you see the adjective American, because that could refer to the countries outside of the United States in North and South America. So let's get started to see what's going on in this time period after independence and just before the 20th century. So we're going to look at some common threads today throughout North and South America. What's different, what's similar. So when you're doing a review of your notes, try to make a comparison. What is similar between these countries? What's different? So let's look at some emerging political ideas in North and South America. Well, we're going to see a trend in American, so meaning North and South America history, concerning the role of government in politics. Well, considering the role of the people in politics. And we're going to see that with the rise of personalist leaders. And what are personalist leaders? Well, they're leaders who use their charisma to rally citizens for whatever cause that leader wants to happen. Personalist leaders, they're very much what we would consider as populists. They believe that politics is a conflict between the elite, the people in charge, and everybody else, the people. However, it's kind of important to realize this isn't necessarily a left-leaning or socialist idea. It could be a right-wing thing. It could be a left-wing thing. It's really a vaguely defined elite, whoever they might be. They're just the people in charge versus the people. And that's not necessarily every person. So personalist leaders often rally people for their cause, rally their supporters for whatever cause they want. And oftentimes this cause isn't necessarily bounded by any constitution. In some ways, it's kind of, not to get too modern day politics on us, but thinking about the January 6th kind of uprising, however you might want to call it, this idea of the president rallying his supporters to do something that's not necessarily legal. So let's look at two big examples, one from South America and one who is on the $20 bill, Andrew Jackson. But let's first look at Jose Antonio Paez. Paez is a politician, a former general, I should say, from Venezuela. He was in the fight against Spain during the independence wars. He was born uneducated. He was a frontiersman. He was poor. And he rose through the ranks through the war for independence. He became a prominent guerrilla general. He was very effective, and he rallied the peasants in Venezuela to support this independence movement. And again, remember, a lot of these independence movements, I would say almost all of them, are largely led by the Creole class, so white property owners in these Latin American countries. But Paez made a lot of inroads in rallying non-property owners, especially property-less owning peasants in Venezuela. And from this popularity as a general, he was able to rally support for himself. When Venezuela broke apart from Gran Colombia, it became an independent republic. And who's the natural choice to lead this independent republic? It's Paez. He views himself as a George Washington-ish figure. However, Paez, he's not going to be perturbed by the fact that there are limits to what the president can do. He is going to serve for a long time as president of Venezuela. He's deposed at one point, then he comes back. But he rules for a long time. He ignores constitutional limits on the presidency. And he's able to get this legitimacy through popular support. He does a lot of reforms that are very popular among landless peasants. And in many ways, we kind of contrast him with Simón Bolívar. Bolívar was very much pro-limits on presidential power. The problem with Bolívar, in comparison to Paez didn't want to give up his power. He is eventually exiled. He lives in the United States for a little bit. But he is a representation of how political leaders use popular anger against an elite to rally their own support for their own power. And let's turn now to the United States with our 7th president, Andrew Jackson. And you'll learn more about him in your AP US history class. A lot more about him. Well, let's get a brief overview. So Jackson was, like Paez, born poor. He was born in the frontier. He was born in, modern day South Carolina, but he's most associated with Tennessee. He also is a self-made man, and he rose through his prominence in the military, especially in the War of 1812 against the British. He became a prominent politician as a result of his military career. And as a politician, he's going to rally a lot of farmers in the West, well, I should say the Midwest of back then, or of today, and he's going to rally farmers in the South against an uncaring elite. So a lot of the presidents so far, they've been educated college guys. They apparently don't speak for poor farmers. And Jackson does. That's how he is going to win the presidency. However, he's going to be a very controversial president, even by today's standards, not just for the things he did to Native Americans, but also in terms of how he treats the office of the presidency. He forgoes a lot of formalities. He invites farmers into the White House during his inaugural celebration. When he becomes president, he opens the White House doors. A bunch of peasants tear up the place. They leave a big wheel of cheese in the White House basement, but that's a different thing. And he is going to very much not respect a lot of constitutional limits on what the presidency can do. He kind of he circumvents, I should say, the Supreme Court. And this is another example of a personalist leader. He does things that aren't necessarily legal, but he gets legitimacy through common popular support. And we're going to see this as a trend throughout North and South American history. We're going to see this in Brazil with Getúlio Vargas. We're going to see this even in the 1900s with Juan Perón in Argentina. It is using popular support to gain legitimacy and then doing things that aren't necessarily legal or constitutionally allowed, I should say. So that's what a personalist leader is. And again, this is something common in North and South America. But something else that we're seeing is the threat of regionalism. And what is regionalism? Well, it's loyalty to a region and not an entire country. So let's see a few examples of this. Well, in many ways, throughout Latin America, a lot of these early national governments are very weak compared to the colonial governments. Remember, Spain and Portugal directly ran these colonies. There was no real independence, autonomy that was given to these places. So these colonies were under the iron fist, you could say, of the Spanish, of the Portuguese. But now that's gone. How do we govern after they leave? Well, this is going to lead to a lot of conflicts, especially, again, going back to that debate between centralists and federalists. Federalists, as you remember, they want a sharing of national power and regional power. Think the United States. We have a national government, and then we have state governments. Centralists, on the other hand, they don't want this regional power. They want a strong, centralized national government. And early attempts to have a centralist government, like with Gran Colombia, is going to fail. These multi-state federations, multi-region federations, they are going to fail because there is an unwillingness of local regional powers to give up their power to the hands of a central government. So we will see the breakup of national federations like Gran Colombia. We'll see the creation of modern day countries like Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and eventually Panama, but we'll get to that. And this is in contrast to this initial period of independence. Remember, guys like Simón Bolívar, they wanted basically South America to be one mega country. That doesn't happen because there is this regionalist mindset. These local caudillos, military leaders, they don't want to give up power to some national government. Instead, they want a strong regional-based government system. They want federal governments. So the threat of regionalism is breaking up multinational states that emerged immediately after independence. They're saying we don't want to give up power, we don't want to share power, let's focus on our own region. So that's what's going on in a lot of Latin American countries. And we're going to see that as well in the United States. So we will see the rise of what we call sectionalism, meaning the different states in the United States, they don't want to share power with the national government. They don't want to share power with other states. So sectionalism, especially over the issue of slavery, is going to lead to conflict in the United States, like the Civil War, the American Civil War. So we have a divide between slave states and the so-called free states over the issue of slavery. When the North seems like they want to get rid of slavery, they don't really, they just want to limit its expansion. Then the South is going to secede, make their own stupid country called the Confederacy, and then they will break into civil war, the United States. And then just not to get political again, but I don't really see the problem with a Confederate flag. I mean, what's wrong with a white flag of surrender? Anyway, so regionalism is an issue going on in North and South America. But we're also seeing a lot of conflict between these different countries, between these different states, these different nations. So we are going to see a lot of wars going on, not only in South America, but in North America. So what's going on? Well, we're going to see a lot of conflicts, as I'm saying, especially over defining national borders, acquisition to natural resources, and who's going to be the main trading power in the Americas. That's kind of something in the background. Who's going to dominate local areas? So in North America, who's going to dominate trade there? Well, as we'll see, it's going to be the United States. In South America, who's going to dominate local trade? It's going to be countries like Argentina and Brazil. And to secure this economic dominance, we're going to see a lot of wars going on. And what are these wars? Well, we're going to see things like the Mexican-American War. So the United States is going to declare war on Mexico and seize a lot of land, the northern parts of Mexico, today's modern day California, New Mexico, Arizona, our wonderful state. So this is going to allow for the dominance, you could say, of the United States in North America. They seized a lot of resource-rich land that Mexico previously owned. It's going to get California. And then what do you know it? California discovers gold a year after, or I should say, the year the Mexican-American War ends. And we're going to see that also in South America. We see things like the War of the Triple Alliance between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay against Paraguay. And as we talked about, this is going to have a downside, a down effect, or a negative effect for Brazil in that it loses a lot of people. However, it is securing the economic dominance of countries like Argentina and Brazil. And then we see something similar with the War of the Pacific. So basically, Chile and Bolivia, they go to war. Bolivia wants access to the Pacific Ocean. Chile doesn't want that, and Chile actually is going to win. Chile is going to be a dominant trading power, a dominant mining power for South America. However, we're also seeing the involvement of European powers, or at least the threat of European involvement. Europe tries to establish an economic foothold in North and South America. We're going to still see colonies in the Caribbean. So this is going to legitimize attempts by European powers to intervene in North and South America. We will see wars, especially between the British and the United States, the War of 1812, for example. And then eventually we will see America go to war with Spain when Spain tries to establish a firmer control over Cuba. But this threat of foreign involvement by Europe, it's going to be largely opposed by an emerging power in the North and South American regions. It's the United States. The United States is saying, hey, we're the dominant power here. Europe, hands off. Stay away from North and South America. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is. It's a hands-off policy. It's the United States saying, Europe, you can't colonize North or South America, because that is an attack on the United States' interests. We, meaning the United States, want to have an economic presence in North and South America, not compete with Europe. So that's what the Monroe Doctrine is. It's this idea of America being the supervisor, you could say, of North and South America, supervising them to be friendly to the United States so that they will be so grateful and basically hand the reins off to the United States to control their economies. And we'll see this explosion of American interest in North and South America, especially when America industrializes. We're going to say, we need a market to sell all of our industrial goods. North and South America, they seem like a great place to do that. Let's sell all of our cheaply made industrial goods to non-industrial countries. So this is going to lead to the rise of America as the United States, as a superpower, not only in North and South America, but as we'll see later on throughout the world. And to secure this worldwide dominance, we're going to need to connect both sides of the United States. We're going to build a transcontinental railroad, but everything is done based on shipping. At this point, the plane hasn't been invented. So we need a canal. We need the Panama Canal. We need a canal to connect the East Coast of America and the West Coast because it takes so long to get around South America. Let's cut it in half by cutting Central America in half. And we're going to see America get this through intervention in Colombia. So Colombia controls the region that will become Panama, but then suddenly there's some sort of Panamanian independence movement. And guess who's supporting this? It's the United States. And Panama is going to win. It's going to get its independence. And what do you know? They're so grateful they give us the land to build a canal. There was some backroom deals. But America is using its military force to get what it wants economically, even though it doesn't directly control Panama. It only directly controls this canal. So that's what's going on in terms of regional and international wars. But as we're going to see, there are also shared social problems within these countries. And in many ways, they're going to be about very similar issues. So let's look at them. It's Martin Luther King Day tomorrow. Happy Sunday. So one of the things that is going to unite these North and South American countries is how they deal with Native Americans, with indigenous people. Because remember, indigenous people, they were the ones here first. They are the First Nations, as the Canadians like to call them. So let's look at a very generalized picture of North American and South American countries and their native peoples. Well, it's mostly going to be shaped by diplomacy and war. But remember, for many years, these indigenous people have been sort of beaten down by the Spanish or the Portuguese or the English or well, not so much the French, but to a degree, them as well. So these colonial governments, they really had set the policies that we're going to see with these independent countries. But as we saw with the Americans, there is some attempt by these colonial governments to restrict the colonial expansion into Native American land. This was done because not necessarily out of concern for Native Americans, but a concern of wasting money in wars against them. But now Spain, Portugal, the British, they're gone. So it's these new independent countries that will direct policy regarding Native Americans. And the American Native Americans, so North and South American indigenous people, Amerindians, they are a threat, a challenge, you could say, to the economic expansion of Latin and North American countries. If development has to be connected with land and people live on that land, we need to kick them off. So by the end of the 19th century, by the 20th century, we're going to see the culmination of a lot of wars against indigenous people. So these indigenous people are either going to be killed off or forced onto reservations, forced onto very uninhabitable land not wanted by white settlers. Remember, it's white property owners who dominate these newly independent countries. So let's look at the United States first. Well, because of guys like Andrew Jackson, who are rallying the popular resentment of Native Americans, we're going to see official policy that will allow for the expansion of the United States. We're going to first see that with things like the Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal Act. So groups of Native Americans in modern-day Georgia, they're going to be kicked off of their land. They're forced into reservations across the Mississippi River in Oklahoma. And this is a terrible act because it kicks them off of their land, but it's a very brutal treatment in that transfer from Georgia to Oklahoma. And it's going to be American, meaning the United States' government policy, to expand into Native American land, either kill them off, make them assimilate, so adopt white ideas of property ownership, or force them into reservations. These two kind of go hand in hand. So we see United States official policy with regards to Native Americans through military conflict. We call that the Indian Wars. And these are going to last until the 20th century, until indigenous people are officially granted citizenship in the United States. Because that's another thing that unites North and South America. Native Americans aren't considered citizens. They are viewed as a foreign threat within their countries. They're basically viewed as domestic terrorists, if you will, simply because they want to live on the land they've lived on for thousands of years. Crazy. And we see very similar developments in South America, especially in Argentina and Chile. These are countries dominated by white property owners, much like the United States. And we're going to see very similar policies regarding Native Americans. So Native Americans are either going to be defeated militarily, they're forced to assimilate, or they're forced to go onto reservations. We see similar things in Argentina and Chile. And initially, Native Americans are kind of allowed to do what they want in terms of cattle production, in terms of ranching in Argentina and Chile. But increasingly, cattle ranching is viewed as an international market. We can get rich off of exporting beef. That's what these Argentinian and Chilean leaders are looking at. So they want to encourage white settlement of indigenous land because this is prime land for ranching. So a lot of the policies against Native Americans, they're directed by an interest in economic development. They don't want indigenous people raising these cows. They want white settlers to be involved in the cattle industry. Therefore, this is why we see increased government wars against Native Americans in Argentina and Chile. And we're going to see things as well in Mexico that very much follow this trajectory that we see in the US and in South America. Well, the main indigenous group in Mexico, especially in more Central American, so tropical Mexico, you could say, is the Mayan people. Remember, the Mayan are an ethnic group, in addition to being that civilization we talked about years ago, well, last year. So we see a period of forced assimilation of the Mayans. But the Mayans are going to resist this. They are going to, especially in the area of Yucatan, so the peninsula area in Mexico, we're going to see a series of wars known as the Caste Wars. And this is a rebellion of Mayans against attempts to seize their land. The Mayans want to rule the Yucatan for themselves. They want their own country free of Mexican control. And it's going to be a very bloody and a very long process. So initially, there is this reaction against seizing Mayan land. Then there is the war that starts. But it's going to be very sporadic fighting. A lot of it's going to be guerrilla warfare. And it's not going to end until the 20th century, until the Mayan finally say enough is enough. We've been fighting for all this time. We are on the verge of not being a thing anymore. So this is going to have increased Mexican government control over the Mayan people. And kind of as a general theme with regards to indigenous people, is this justification of military expansion by demonizing indigenous people. They are quote unquote savages against civilization that these North and South American countries seek to bring. We definitely see that in the US. We definitely see that in Argentina, in Chile. So there is a lot of racism that's directing this policy against Native American. It's economic interest and it is racial superiority. That is what is driving this conflict against indigenous people. All right, let's go on. This is not a fun lecture, is it? No. So let's talk about people of African descent. So we gradually see the abolition of slavery. We're going to see this in the independence movements in Latin America. Mexico is one of the first to get rid of slavery. But it is going to be a very slow process, even though these revolutions, like the American Revolution, like the independence movements, they want egalitarian ideas. They want social equality. That's not going to be extended to people of color necessarily. And it's not going to be extended to slaves, especially. We will, however, see the rise of abolitionists, of people who want to end chattel slavery. And this is a very slow process because there is this reliance on slave labor in these economies. If these colonies, especially in Latin America, were so focused on raw material export, then they need a cheap labor source to do that. So that's why we see a very slow process to get rid of slavery. So we will see the elimination of slavery eventually by the end of the 19th century. We're going to see this in the United States as a result of those sectional conflicts. We will see that as a result of the Civil War. That is what gets rid of chattel slavery. Legally, it's over because of the 13th Amendment. The South loses politically, but not culturally. But that's a different thing. You'll learn about that in APUSH. However, even after slavery is abolished in these places, as we will see, there is going to still be prejudice and discrimination. In the US, you will still see laws that discriminate against African Americans. We will see that in things known as Jim Crow laws. This is legalized segregation, for instance. It's preventing African Americans from voting. And we also see social movements that are opposed to African American equality. We see that with organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. We see that with the rise of social Darwinist thinking, going back to last presentation, in terms of race. White people are superior, Black people are inferior, according to these white racists. But let's look at what's going on in Latin America, what's going on in Brazil, what's going on in the Caribbean. Well, let's first look at the Caribbean. Well, we have seen the elimination of slavery as a result of things like the Haitian Revolution. Awesome, no more slavery in Saint-Domingue, in Haiti. However, this is really scary for colonial governments. It's scary for any slave-owning society. What if the slaves revolted and killed all the white people, like what happened with Haiti? Never mind. Yes, that's the fear of these colonial governments, of these slave-owning governments. So we are going to see some attempts at rebellion from slave societies. However, they're not going to be as successful. We will see the gradual elimination of slavery in the Caribbean. So Britain is going to stop the slave trade in 1807, and then eventually we will see the elimination of slavery in British colonies by the 1830s. France is going to get rid of slavery in its colonies in 1848, one of the good things from that revolution. The Dutch will get rid of slavery. However, slavery is still going to last in places that are held onto as colonies, especially by the Spanish. The Spanish still have Cuba. Slavery is going to stay until the 1870s, and slavery is still going to stay in Puerto Rico until the 1870s as well. And we also are going to see the elimination gradually of slavery in Brazil. Brazil is going to get rid of slavery in the 1880s. It's the last country to legally get rid of African chattel slavery. But slavery is a very important part of the Brazilian economy, with the coffee plantations, the fazendas, with the sugar plantations. And that's why we see such a slow process. It's this economic dependence on exporting raw materials produced with slave labor. But as I mentioned, there is a very slow process for equality, even after slavery is eliminated. We will see legalized and social discrimination against people of color, people of African descent. We will see we will see movements among people of color to show that they are equal to white people and demand legal and political equality. We will see that in the United States with the eventual civil rights movement. We will see attempts to overturn racial stereotypes of people of African descent. And to a degree, we do see a success for mixed race people in Latin America. Remember, Latin America was more fluid in its racial hierarchy than it was in places like the United States, meaning people of mixed race descent, they could achieve a level of equality, of social status in Latin America. And we will see that after slavery goes away. However, again, remember, these countries are dominated by, you guessed it, white middle-class property owners. So that's what's going on in terms of slavery. That's what's going on in terms of African American rights. What's going on with immigration? Well, what is going on with immigration? So we're going to see a lot of social issues, a lot of political issues concerning immigration, not only in North America, but in South America as well. We're going to see increased immigration as a result of political conflict in Europe, as a result of changes in Asia. And these immigrants, they're going to make their way to North and South America. But much of immigration prior to the independence era is African slaves. That's why we see presence of people of African descent in North and South America. Remember, everyone who isn't an indigenous person in North and South America, they're immigrants. They got here from the old world. However, after the end of the slave trade, after the formal end of the transatlantic slave trade, we're going to see increased immigration. And the new immigrants, you could say, they are people from Europe and Asia. They're going to flock to these huge cities that are emerging in these post-independent countries, places like Buenos Aires in Argentina, Chicago and New York in the United States, Chicago in the United States, Sao Paulo in Brazil. These are places of significant immigrant population, of significant immigrant presence. And European immigrants, when they come to the United States, but when they come to American countries as a whole, they tend to come to places that aren't dominated by slavery, because European immigrants don't want to compete with free labor, with unfree labor, with people who aren't paid. So a lot of these immigration patterns, they're going to primarily white areas. They're going to very white places like the north of the United States. They're going to very white places like Buenos Aires or in Brazil. And we are going to see a lot of immigrants, especially from East Asia, from India and China. They're going to basically work as temporary or indentured workers. So we will see a presence of people of Chinese descent, people of Asian descent, or people of Indian descent in the Americas, mostly working as contracted workers. They come here for a period of time, they send money back, and then maybe they leave. But some are going to stay. Some are going to become part of these immigrant cultures that emerge. So in the United States, we will see a huge increase of immigrants coming from Europe, especially. Europe is going through revolutions. They're going through famines like the Irish potato famine. So they're going to come to the United States for economic opportunity, for political stability. And a very similar thing in Argentina and Brazil. A lot of these immigrants, they are, again, white Europeans. However, we do see a degree of East Asian immigration, especially from China. A lot of Chinese immigrants, they're going to go to Peru or Canada or the United States. They're looking for economic opportunity from overpopulated places like China. India is also going to have overpopulation as well. It's going to have to send, in terms of economic reasons, Indian workers to find work someplace else. They're going to find that in emerging economies in North and South America. And even in these colonies that remain in the Caribbean, this is where we're going to see a lot of indentured servants, you could say, from British possessions like India. Britain has places like Guyana in South America, and it's going to send either as penal prisoners or as indentured servants to its colonies in South America from India. However, the presence of immigrants is going to be a threat, a perceived threat to the dominant white property owners who control these North and South American countries. Immigrants, they oftentimes are bringing, well, they always are, they're bringing their own distinct cultures to places that have their own distinct culture. So immigrants are going to be viewed as a threat to cultural cohesion. And even when immigrants are desired for economic reasons, we need a new workforce. There's going to be a preference for which type of immigrant, for European immigrants especially. And Asian immigrants, they are viewed with hostility throughout North and South America. In the US, we see a lot of riots against Chinese people. We will see the exclusion, the legal exclusion of Chinese immigrants in things like the aptly named Chinese Exclusion Act. In Canada and Peru and Mexico, we will see anti-Chinese prejudice. So much more of a focus on local or European groups. We will see similar prejudice against Japanese migrants in Brazil and Indians in former British colonies as well. And when I say Indians, I mean people from India. So there is prejudice against non-European immigrants, but European immigrants even face prejudice themselves, especially groups like Italians or people of Spanish descent. Jewish people are viewed with hostility, especially those coming from Eastern Europe. Irish people, they are viewed as not completely white. Germans sometimes aren't considered completely white by these weird groups who control North and South American countries. They don't fit the definition of whiteness. So immigrants in general are viewed as a threat to local, to domestic, native-born workers, because immigrants oftentimes accept very low wages because they're so desperate for economic opportunity in a new place. They'll take what they are given. And we're going to see debates about the role of these different groups of people in the newly independent countries in North and South America. On the one hand, we will see what we call nativism. Nativism means a focus and hostility against people who were born in foreign countries. So we will see immigration limits to prevent more foreigners, quote unquote, from coming into the United States, from coming into Latin American countries. So nativism is this hostility to foreigners. That's what it is. And there is an expectation that when these foreigners come, that they assimilate into the new country they've come to. And we're going to see that especially in schools, in public education. There is very much of a focus on national culture. You have to speak English if you're in the United States. You can't speak stupid things like Polish. You have to speak English. Same thing in Latin American countries. If you're going to Argentina, you have to speak Spanish. There's very much a focus on eliminating foreign culture in favor of national culture. So that's what's going on with immigration, and we'll talk about it again in a second. What's going on with women? What is going on with women? Well, even though women will participate in these initial independence struggles, women don't have legal equality. They barely have social equality. However, we are going to see a demand for political equality, especially in the women's suffrage movement, in the right to vote. However, it's important to remember that even though we will see these movements, they are largely dominated by white women. They are dominated by wealthy white women. So we will see a slow struggle for women equality, for female equality. We will see things like the women's suffrage movement, as I've been saying, in places like the US. We see this in the Seneca Falls Convention. This was a gathering of middle-class women. There were people of color there as well, but it is this movement of supporting women's suffrage. It is a mass gathering to demand, hey, women deserve these natural rights that we talked about in the American independence movement. And on top of that, we will see eventual progress for political, economic, and legal equality in Latin America, in the US, in Canada. And much of this focus is on education and suffrage. Women deserve equal access to education. They deserve political rights. And we are going to see eventual suffrage throughout North and South America by the 20th century. The United States in the 1920s, places like Argentina in the 1930s and 40s. So again, it's important to remember that working class women, they're not involved in these movements. Why? Well, I'm sure they want to be, but they're forced working. They're working class women. They have to raise their families. They have to earn money for their family's upkeep. So working class women play very little, very minimal role in these women's rights movement. We do see, however, a transformation in female participation in the workplace. We will see female workers in factories, in local markets. Eventually, we will see jobs outside of the home, and this is, in a way, a step towards economic equality, at least between men and women. So this is transforming gender relations, but again, very much modeled off of European patriarchal ideas. Women belong in the home. However, it is important to realize that we are seeing the rise of distinct American, so North and South America, cultures in these independent countries. And generally the tension is between, should we be more like Europe or should we have our own national culture? without European influence. Elite people, they tend to model themselves after what's fashionable in Europe. They're going to be involved in all of those literary movements that don't matter in this class, Romanticism, Neoclassicism, these sorts of things. However, popular culture is largely the same. It's largely going to stay what it was regardless of European influence. So much more of a focus on, oh, my screen. Okay. Much more of a focus on local traditions. And as we've been seeing, there's largely the dominance of this white elite in these countries that's preventing more local cultures from coming to the forefront. We do see the kind of challenge that immigrants play or pose to desires for unified national cultures. However, immigrants do enrich and help define these national cultures. They are going to bring with them a lot of their own cultural influences that are going to make their way to North and South America. Especially, we'll see that with something like the United States. The hot dog is a German thing, and it's something that is seen as distinctly American. So that's an example right there of how foreign cultures are integrating and becoming symbols of national culture. So let's go back to immigrants for a second. When they come to America, they largely are not going to be welcomed as part of the wider society. So they are mostly going to focus on internal group support, basically. That's why we see places like Little Italy in New York, Chinatowns. That's something we will see throughout North and South America. It's immigrants that decide to, well, are sort of forced to live in secluded areas. This is encouraging a distinct American version of these foreign cultures. So immigrants are coming to the United States, and they are going to have their own special cultures and societies. We will see that in places like the United States with Irish immigrants. They tend to want to support each other. So Irish people tend to stick together. They will form things like up here, the Hibernian Society. And Irish people are going to very much be closely knitted together in American politics, especially. But we are seeing this blend, as I've been saying, of foreign ideas and local ideas putting together. We see the emergence of new dialects, especially with the influence of immigrants. For instance, in the United States, there's American English, which is really a combination of all of these different cultures and English. So there is influence not only from these immigrant cultures like Germans and Irish and Italian people, but also from African Americans. So really, American culture is a hodgepodge of different influences of local white culture, whatever that might be, of European cultures, of African cultures. This is an example of cultural syncretism. There's that $1 million word yet again. We will see the blending of different groups to make a distinct national culture. For instance, if we look at something like salsa or samba in South America, this is a blend of various different influences, of the Spanish influences, of dance and whatnot, of music, of blending together indigenous, African, and European influences all together. So this is what's going on in terms of American culture. We do see a preference among the elite for European culture. However, with the presence of immigrants, with this traditional lower class, with popular culture, there is going to be the blending of these different influences into something unique that will help define these North and South American countries. What does it mean to be a member of the United States, a citizen of the United States? What does it mean to be a citizen of Brazil culturally? What does it mean to be a citizen of Peru culturally? That's what's going on here. And again, if you have any questions, email, remind me. So think about these questions right here before we move on to some economic developments. What challenges do indigenous people face? What challenges do people of African descent face? And then what is nativism? What is assimilation? So let's look at changing economic environments in North and South America. We're going to see a difference between what goes on in North America, especially the United States, what goes on in the rest of the Americas. Well, it's going to be this conflict between these two terms up here, development and underdevelopment. So let's see what we mean by this. So we're going to see a conflict, especially between those who have money and those who don't have money. And that's something we've been seeing throughout the Industrial Revolution. Well, even though these independence movements have very much big ideas about social equality, especially among white people, they are in theory egalitarian, but little is done in terms of racial equality, little is done especially in terms of economic equality. Sure, we got rid of slavery, yeah, and sure, we're going to eventually give Native Americans citizenship rights. However, we are going to see how these socio-political problems will contribute to economic problems. So one of the reasons why we will see a lot of economic underdevelopment in terms of industrialization, we won't see industrialization in a lot of Latin American countries, it's because there is a lack of a unified political space. So there is a lot of problems with political unification. We've seen this, the debates between liberals and conservatives, federalists and centralists. This is leading to a lack of political unification. And this ties back to regionalism yet again. So places like Gran Colombia, they will break up. Rio de la Plata, they will break up. This is not going to encourage the political environment stability needed for industrialization. We are going to see problems in terms of geographic barriers. There's too high of mountains for political and economic unity. There's going to be underdevelopment in terms of railroads and transportation infrastructure. And there's also a lot of political division, as I've been saying, especially between local, regional powers, caudillos, and the national government. So let's look at Latin American economics. So it is this dominance of the landed elite, of plantation owners. And these landed elites, they basically act like feudal lords in many ways. It's kind of like if the South won the Civil War. It's these landed property plantation owners, so mostly focused on farming, that are going to direct a lot of developments in these regions. These local elites, these landed plantation owners, and then these military caudillos, they don't want a unified nation. They want to focus on themselves. They're very much inward thinking. So they want policies that benefit them in the short term. They aren't really forward thinking. They don't want unified policies that help everyone in the nation. They are more focused on what's going on their plantations. How do we, meaning the individual plantation owners, make more money? And on top of that, indigenous and people of color, they don't have any say in any of these developments. They are the workers for these plantation owners. They have no say. They're either forced onto these lands, in the case with Native Americans, or they're kind of stuck on these lands because of economic relations, like with sharecropping. Sharecropping, basically, you have to pay rent in the form of the stuff you produce. But oh no, I need a loan to buy the tools I need to grow this stuff. Oh, that's no problem. I'll just give you some more money, but you have to pay me back with produce. So there is going to be this kind of cycle of, oh my gosh, I need to pay the rent, I need to pay these loans, but I need loans to have the tools I need to grow my crops so I can grow the crops and sell them, and then I can pay back my loans that I took out to buy the tools I needed to grow the crops that I needed to pay back the loans. It's a cycle. That's what sharecropping is. And who is stuck in this cycle? It's indigenous people. It's Black people. And this is going to be very similar in Latin America and in the post-Civil War South. So there is going to be very much of a underdevelopment because there is no encouragement of social mobility in that we saw in places like Great Britain or in, as we'll see, the United States. And on top of that, all these all these landed elites, these caudillos, they're selling land to foreigners because it's just cheap. It's just a way to make a quick buck, basically. So we will see the selling of plantation land to foreign companies like the United Fruit Company back in the United States. Half of Nicaragua is owned by the United Fruit Company. A single company owns half of the land in an entire country. This is not going to encourage industrialization or economic development beyond exporting raw materials. That's kind of the central theme of underdevelopment, of economies based on selling exports, on selling raw material exports, rather than industrializing. So a lot of these economic developments, they are occurring on plantations. They are occurring in plantations, like I said, sugar plantations in Brazil, in the Caribbean. We do see a degree of mining in Mexico and in Argentina and Chile. Argentina will grow a lot of beef, and it's going to make a lot of money off of this. We're going to see a lot of tobacco and coffee farming in Cuba and Brazil. And we will see the creation of railroads in these Latin American countries. We will see a lot of mining. However, who owns these mines? It's British companies, it's European companies, it's American companies. So that money isn't necessarily benefiting locals, it's benefiting foreign companies. It is a degree of economic development, but it's not benefiting the local peoples of these Latin American countries. It's benefiting who owns the railroads, who owns the mines. It's Britain, it's the United States, it's Europe. And this ties into what are some of the dangers of Latin American economies. Well, it's this dependency on foreign goods, on foreign investment. So it's cheaper to buy industrially made goods from the Europeans than it is to build your own factories. In this way, Latin America can't compete with the United States, can't compete with Europe. And there is going to be a flooding of foreign goods in Latin America, therefore not encouraging industrialization. But how is there going to be money made? It's in the export of raw materials. However, raw materials are cheaper compared to industrially made goods. It's not going to secure financial stability for Latin American countries. Instead, Latin America is dependent on foreign investment and foreign loans. So increasingly, we see a cycle, if you will, of needing to pay these loans back by selling more raw materials, by giving more economic power to American, meaning the United States, companies, to European companies. So foreign investments provide a lot of capital, but it's for European companies. So locals are pushed out of local industry in favor of foreigners. So because of that, we won't see economic development on the same scale as what goes on in the United States, what goes on in Europe. It's this heavy reliance on foreign production. It's cheaper to buy from foreigners than it is to build our own factories. That's one reason. Our economies are not based on industry. They're based on selling raw materials. And on top of that, Latin American countries, they get loans from Europeans, from the United States. And that's going to put them into a lot of debt. And on top of that, who actually owns what industry does occur? It's Europeans, it's the United States. So these are some dangers to Latin American development. We are going to see some industrialization. And where are we going to see that? Most especially, it's in the United States. It's in the northern states of the United States, in places like New York and Massachusetts. The South won't industrialize until the 20th century. The South is very much like these Latin American countries, in the sense that local elites, local plantation owners dominate. They don't want industrialization. They just want to make money selling raw materials like cotton. So it's a very slow process for industrialization in South America. So kind of as a consequence of the fact we won't see a lot of economic development in Latin America, only a few countries in the Americas are actually going to have the same living standards as the Europeans. For instance, the United States, Argentina, and Canada. These are countries with comparable standards of living to the United States. Well, yes, but to Europe, I should say. And why is that? Well, these countries have a lot in terms of economic potential. They have a lot of land, a lot of open land, no geographic limits like we see in Latin America. We will see a lot diverse resources. The United States, they can indulge in plantations, sure, with cotton, but they can also grow wheat in the Midwest. They can mine in the American West. They can do multiple industries. So there is a diversification of what raw materials they have for export if they wanted to, or for internal industrialization. The United States, for instance, has a lot of coal. We can build factories, much like Great Britain could build factories. But we also see this heavy immigration that is going to assist in industrialization. We see this because this is going to allow for a cheap labor pool. So this is going to encourage industrialization. More immigrants are going to places like the US and Argentina and Canada. So there is a larger worker population. More workers means it's easier to industrialize. We will see a mining boom across Latin America. And this will benefit to a degree because they have a new natural resource. But in places like Mexico and Chile, who owns these companies? It's not Chileans, it's not Mexicans, it's foreigners. In the United States, we do see a mining boom. But who owns these mines? It's Americans, it's people from the United States. And kind of in general, we see a difference between those who industrialize and those who don't. The industrializers, they will benefit. Places like the US and Canada and not Latin America and Argentina. But if you have an economy based on raw material exports, this isn't benefiting countries as a whole. It's benefiting who owns these raw material places. It benefits British companies, it benefits American, United States companies, it benefits other European powers. And we are going to see global markets that will influence who industrializes, who doesn't. So America and Canada, America meaning the United States, they're going to come into being as a result of times of economic growth in the global market. There's a demand for what the United States has. There's a demand for what Canada has. They're able to make a lot of money, a lot of capital. Therefore, they're able to industrialize. However, Latin America came into independence during times of economic crises. They don't have the capital the same way America, the United States, and Canada has capital. And on top of that, they have weaker political situations. Remember, there's all these civil wars, centralists versus federalists, liberals versus conservatives. And all of this is going to have the effect of underdevelopment in Latin America. This is going to allow foreign markets to make inroads in Latin America. First, it's the British. Then it's going to be the Americas' big neighbor to the north, the United States. And then looking at changes in what's going on to the environment. Well, let's look at that. Well, we will see urbanization. We will see the rise of populations as a result of immigration in North and South America. So this is going to encourage industrialization. However, we see the same problems that we saw back in Great Britain. So there is going to be the problems of urbanization, rapid urbanization. There's no sewage system. There's a bunch of poop in the streets. We see that throughout North and South America. So urbanization is going to put a lot of strain on water delivery services. It's also going to put a lot of strain on the lumber industry, a lot on forests, where we'll see massive amounts of deforestation to accommodate for urbanization. We're going to see a lot of mining. And mining is good for economic development, sure, but it's terrible for the environment. It causes a lot of pollution, a lot of runoff. It causes a lot of erosion of of mountains. And if these countries need to compete with Europe, with the United States, and they want to industrialize, well, the environment's got to take one for the team. So we will see environmental devastation as a result of changes in the global economy. We will see it as a result of industrialization. We will see it as because of a demand for raw materials. So these urban environments right here, as you can see, very crowded places. Oftentimes, multiple families could fit in the same apartment. We will see dangerous mining conditions, which are not only bad for workers, but bad for the environment. So these are problems in terms of these new economic developments. All right, so that concludes our presentation today. I have a few videos. One is about the Battle of Little Bighorn. Watch that on your time. That describes the United States and its conflicts with Native Americans. And one is about the Panama Canal. So thank you for listening. Outro music. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Buy that merch. Go to www.cia.gov. No, yeah, I'm a CIA op. We'll talk about the CIA in Latin America later on, but that's not right now. Okay, that's enough of me talking. Bye.